Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to an exciting, exhilarating edition of Fighting Game Thursday. In this weekly show that I started nearly a year ago now, we have looked at all sorts of important games within fighting games' interesting history. In this week's episode we are going to take an in-depth look at a game which is certainly one of Capcom's more obscure fighting entries, and a game that would serve as the swan song for Capcom's System arcade boards. The game in question today was developed to run on the same hardware as the now loved Street Fighter 3 and was even programmed by the same team too, meaning that this game, that is based on a Japanese manga that shares the same title, has a certain air of quality to it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure, Street Fighter 3's weird half-brother of a game. Yeah! In the past on this channel, the subject of Street Fighter 3 is often raised. The game is a polarising topic to discuss as it is beloved by the fighting game community, but has always been practically ignored by most mainstream gamers. We have discussed why this was the case time and time again on the channel, but its lack of success came down to that in the 90s many people were no longer interested in 2D sprites. There were too many Street Fighter games, the game was locked to the arcade for a few years before arriving on the poor selling Dreamcast, and if people were going to play a Street Fighter game, they would rather play as their old reliable favourite characters, rather than this bunch of new weirdos that no one asked for. Some even argued that the game's fighting mechanics have a steeper learning curve too, which put many consumers off. But in contrast, this very same reason is why many more hardcore fighting game players flocked to this title in years later. People have always said that the reason the game and its iterations were always Dreamcast home exclusives for a good while was because Street Fighter 3 was developed to run on the powerful Capcom System 3 arcade board. A board that allows Street Fighter 3 to contain so many animation frames within its character movements that when the game was released in arcades in 1997, the Sega Saturn, PlayStation and Nintendo 64 would not be able to handle the experience, meaning that Capcom had to wait for the release of the first console from the next generation. Speaking of the Capcom System 3 library, the hardware also featured another game we have looked at before on this channel, known as Red Earth. This high-quality fantasy-themed fighting game was the very first to be released for the System 3, as early as 1996, which meant Capcom never even got round to bothering trying to port this one to consoles. Basically, the System 3 board was not great hardware to program games for that would be easy to port to home systems of the era. The two most successful consoles of the time, the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64, were both geared towards delivering polygon model-based experiences, rather than games featuring state-of-the-art sprite animations, meaning that after Red Earth and the Street Fighter 3s, Capcom would only ever bother making one more game for the arcade board, which is of course JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure, the very subject of this bloody video. JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure was sandwiched in between the release of Street Fighter Second Impact and Third Strike, which as mentioned previously was developed by the Street Fighter 3 team. JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure is a fighting game that was created using an existing license, with the franchise first existing as a manga series written and illustrated by Hirohiko Araki back in 1987. The plot that spans multiple series follows a different protagonist in each, however each lead is a member of the Joestar family, whose mainline descendants possess a star-shaped birthmark above their left shoulder blade, and a name that can be abbreviated to the titular JOJO. Basically, each series follows the protagonist's bizarre adventure. The first series, set in 19th century England, is known as the Phantom Blood arc, and it follows Jonathan Joestar and his newly adopted brother, Dio Brando, who loathes Jonathan and plans to usurp him as the heir to the Joestar family throne. However, he is thwarted in his plans, so in an act of desperation he uses an ancient stone mask to transform himself into a vampire. The series revolves around Jonathan trying to stop Dio achieving his new goal of world domination, which is achieved through using martial art techniques known as Hammon, that allows its users to focus bodily energy into sunlight via controlled breathing. Now, when it comes to the second arc, known as Battle Tendency, it is set across both North America and Europe in 1938, and follows the life of Jonathan's grandson, Joseph, who has a natural affinity for Hammond. Joseph and his allies in this series take on the Pillar Men, powerful humanoids whose race created the stone mask that turned Dio into a vampire. The Pillar Men must be stopped, as they seek the powerful red stone of Aja that would make them into ultimate beings. Now, that was just the first 2 arcs, however, as mentioned, there are 8 in total, each focusing on different generations of the same family. But it is Arc 3 which is most important in this video, and perhaps the JoJo franchise is most important overall, as this would be the series that would spawn its own 1993 animated TV show, and of course later in 1998 the Capcom System 3 game. But what was it about the third arc that inspired all of this? Let us discuss. You see, the third series is set in 1989 and follows Japanese high school student Jotaro Kujo, which instantly explains why this was made the starting point for both the game and the anime. Basically, it seems in Japan that if characters are made to be Japanese high school students, franchises start printing money. Just look at the Persona series for example, after they made a Shin Megami Tensei game set in a high school. Or the Sailor Bloody Moon franchises. People love this sort of crap. The System 3 game, the anime, and the third arc of the manga follow the story of Jotaro, who has developed a supernatural ability known as a stand. Approached by his grandfather, Joseph Joestar, Jotaro learns that this power is the result of the influence of the sworn enemy of the Joestar family, the vampire discussed earlier known as Dio. Jotaro's mother's life is put in danger when she starts developing a stand that she can't control. Jotaro and Joseph go on a quest to destroy Dio so they can cure her. I wonder if they are going to adapt JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure into an anime one day. It certainly has been a strange year for him too. Now, all of this brings us back round to the game itself. The game was a perfect property for Capcom to use when creating a fighting game, as the company already had a great deal of experience creating games featuring an anime art style anyway, such as the Street Fighter Alpha games and the Darkstalkers series. This means that using Hirohiko Araki's colourful characters, Capcom were able to develop a visually detailed game which was highly stylised. When it comes to the artwork and gameplay found in this title, to help remain faithful to the source material, Araki would work on the game as a consultant, advising Capcom's employees on decisions and even creating exclusive pieces of artwork for its promotion and packaging. Most notably, he even developed from scratch a new character design for one particular character known as Midler, since Capcom was interested in using her in the game and she had been only shown from the waist down in the original manga. In regards to the game, as mentioned, it first debuted in the arcades in December of 1998, but would become the final Capcom System 3 release when a revised version of the game was released after Street Fighter 3 Third Strike in September of 1999, known as JoJo'S Bizarre Adventure Heritage for the Future, which expanded the game by adding 8 characters, bringing the total roster selection up to 22 in the game's lineup. Seasoned fans of Capcom fighting games will instantly recognise that the title has much in common with its predecessors, in that the game consists of matches between 2 fighters in combat, using a variety of attacks, techniques and special moves in order to deplete their opponent's health bars to achieve victory. The game also includes its own variant of the super move system, allowing fighters to use character-specific super moves. The game's most unique feature, that falls perfectly in line with the game's manga and anime relatives, are characters' abilities to use stands in matches. Basically, powerful projections of fighters' energy that are unique to every fighter in the game. These stands are generally integrated into each character's moveset. However, most characters also possess an active stand, which can be brought both into and out of battle using the stand button. When stands are active, this gives fighters the ability to perform more powerful moves, use special techniques, and even gain special abilities such as the power to be able to double jump. Stands can even sometimes be used to attack separately from their accompanied fighter. Despite stands having their advantages, a great deal of strategy is required to get the best out of them, as they still have their limitations. For example, if a stand is attacked, the accompanying fighter still takes damage, and stands are only available to use if there is energy present in the stand gauge. Further layers of strategy are added by picking moments of when to call on these stands, as gauges refill slowly when a stand is withdrawn. In fact, if the gauge runs out whilst the stand is in use, fighters are temporarily stunned and vulnerable to incoming attacks, so using them right is of the utmost importance. There are scenarios when stands clash against each other, when fighters must mash buttons to overcome their opponent, a feature we have seen previously in other fighting games, and extensive combos can be performed when players combine their own attacks with their stands. There is a lot you can do here. As you can see through all of this, JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure is a beautiful game, which unlike Red Earth, not only saw console releases not too long after its arcade release, but also has even seen a HD version of the game released on modern hardware in more recent times too. Like Street Fighter 3 and its iterations, it is no surprise that this game would see a release on the Sega Dreamcast at home. The game would contain both the original arcade version of the title along with the revised version of the game too, pretty much letting gamers own a definitive arcade copy of the game as soon as the title did make it into the homes. When playing this title, players can opt for either a challenge mode which offers a classic arcade fighting experience or a full-blown story mode. IGN would be thoroughly impressed with the Dreamcast release, stating Street Fighter in Dimension X, Marvel vs Capcom without a tag team, Darkstalkers on acid, however you try to describe the strange Capcom fighter known as JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure, one thing is for sure, you'll never find anything else quite like it. They would summarise with, the best way to describe JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure is that it's a strange and entertaining jaunt into a realm of fighting. If an attempt at something different while keeping the true spirit of Capcom fighting is what you're looking for, then JOJO is for you. Have fun! GameSpot would praise the Dreamcast version of this game too, as in their own words, it offers fine-tuned Capcom quality with a twist, along with the unique storyline and great control. They would add that although most American gamers won't be able to appreciate the subtleties of the storyline and their relation to the manga that spawned it as much as their Japanese counterparts might, there is certainly enough dialogue included into intermittent cutscenes to give you an idea of what's going on. They would conclude that JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure is accessible to both newbies and hardcore gamers alike, which alone is worth its weight in gold. The graphics are as cool as the story. This one is a must for every fighting game fan's library. Now, something else that is worth mentioning with regards to this game is that the Sega Dreamcast would not be the only home console this game would be ported to back in the day, as insanely they somehow managed to port this title to the incredibly underpowered Sony PlayStation. This was the only time in history a Capcom System 3 game would make it over to the basic hardware. So how did it handle this game, and what changes were made? Let's take a look. Rather than featuring both arcade versions of the game like its Dreamcast counterpart, the Sony PlayStation version of the title would instead be based on the original incarnation of the game, but have the 8 characters added to the lineup from the enhanced iteration. An exclusive Super Story mode was even added too, which covers the entire Stardust Crusaders story arc. But how did all of this pan out for Capcom? Obviously, when it was first announced that the game was coming to the PlayStation, by this point in time fans were expecting the worst. They had seen what happened to the likes of X-Men vs Street Fighter when it was ported over to the system, so people were doubtful that JOJO could be programmed to run on the system well. GameSpot would welcomely report though that JOJO on the PlayStation was extremely playable, topping even the porting of Street Fighter Alpha 3 to the platform. They said, Bizarre Adventure retains the arcade version speed and playability, if not all the animation, though some frames of animation appear to have been left on the cutting room floor. If you haven't played the arcade version, you will never notice. Bizarre Adventure plays fast and controls great, even with the PlayStation's controller. To be fair, when you look at the animation found in Street Fighter 3 and compare it side by side with JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure, the game does not feature even close to the same amount of animation frames anyway, so it is not at all that surprising that this game was portable to the PlayStation while Street Fighter 3 was not. The PlayStation version, in my opinion, does not look quite as good as what can be found on the Dreamcast or in the arcades, but the game looks extremely decent for a title that ran on such weak and feeble hardware. Capcom really did work out how to get the best out of the thing by the end of the platform's lifespan, despite many of the difficulties they had faced with it in the early PlayStation days. In regards to JOJO'S Bizarre Adventure, the franchise would continue past this point in the world of gaming, but as far as I'm aware, no game has ever been made that tops the experience found in Capcom's title. Today, I would say that this arcade game is considered fairly obscure, as it was released at a point in time when the masses weren't particularly interested in 2D sprite-based games, no matter how good they looked, and the JoJo anime has never been exactly popular in the West, so it has never had that on its side to help prop up its level of fame either. Despite this, over in Japan, as we know, the franchise is very well known. In fact, rather than remaining an obscure title like in the West, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure would be the most successful arcade game in Japan in 1999, becoming a bestseller, shifting over 300,000 units across the country. So the game certainly achieved a lot more success in some corners of the world than others. But all sales figures and statistics aside, this is still a beautiful little fighting game that brings something a bit different to the table, utilising the underused Capcom System 3 hardware. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Today's subject was chosen by the people who back this channel over on Patreon, who ensure that I can continue to run this channel day to day. Why not suggest some fighting games down below that I can add to ballots for patrons to vote on for future episodes? I welcome new ideas from across this channel's entire community. Special thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, Ryan Dinched, Evan Balder, Philip Manth, Cambo Rambo 82, Azrael Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, SpongeMat B, Glenny Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Bubba Kitty, Ron Studd, Busty St Clair, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Sir Lagley, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Aroliga, Chris Cool, Punky Dudestar, Adrian Hannington, Bernard G, Marco Soto, Richard Stewart, James McDonald, Jesse Tay, Crazy Yarl, Master Jinx, Hans Christian, Tunnel Soundwave, Dan Van Dam, Adam Casting, Gregory Smoradrix, Rick 67, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bull, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruner, Andis Reinsbergs, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Dan Barlow Jr., Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, RetroVerse.com, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazansky, and all of my other patrons. Thanks to all of you so much for continuing to support this channel. Thank you.